in a few months, 2-3 months. But then after that, there is the follow-up period, which we'd like to, make it at least half a year, so that we can see what actually emerges in practice. And all this must be documented very carefully so that it can be used, on one hand, for rigorous research, for analysis, and on the other hand, so that, for instance, we can bring to the next Change Laboratory session some examples from the previous one, so that they always have to reflect back, what did we do last week? How did we perhaps end up in conflict or a dead end? How can we now move beyond that? So there's this constant back and forth reflection, which requires that we videotape every session, and between the sessions we look at some key fragments or segments of the video which we show in the next session, also to provide this sort of continuous reflection on their own process.
And who participates in the sections?
Well, this depends on the activity. For instance, if you have a very large organization like a big hospital, you typically have to decide which part of the hospital will serve as the pilot unit. Okay. And even in a pilot unit, there may be so many employees that it's important that they select you select together with them a representative group, because we have had some change laboratories where we had 60-70 people, but that's very difficult. The quality of the discussion is much more difficult to monitor and to make sense of. So we like to have them, let's say between 10 and 30 people. So for instance, right now, your colleague from the doctoral program, Yuri Lapshin in Moscow, is starting a change laboratory in a big school. And they are selecting about 25 teachers and administrators there, so that to keep it manageable. But they have to be carefully selected so that they somehow represent the diversity in the school or in the given activity system, and that they also have the task of somehow interacting with their colleagues. So that's a tricky issue. It's much easier if you have small units, but the very first change laboratory that was conducted was 1995 in the Finnish post offices, and the post offices were small. So all the mail carriers from a given post office could participate, so it was 100% participation. But most organizations are not like that. Most organizations are relatively large, and it's difficult to find the kind of units which would be. Sometimes you can pick a team. For instance, we have Arja Haapasari, who is working on a change laboratory in a Finnish large company, and she has identified a team which can serve as the pilot unit, and all the members of the team, including the supervisor, are then participants. So if you can find a natural unit which is appropriate size, it's of course easier. But there is no simple answer to that. There are, in the literature, we know about various kinds of large-scale interventions where hundreds of people are involved. We have not gone into that direction because often they tend to become very superficial.
Okay. And what do you mean by superficial?
Well, how do you make sure that the 500 people are involved in real analysis? It's usually they are there as an audience, not really as subjects. And
maybe we cannot be sure also about the real transformation.
Exactly. It becomes very much management-led. Okay. So that typically, when you make this large-scale intervention, it becomes so that these hundreds of people are there in order to listen to the management, to the consultant, to the researchers, to preach them how wonderful things should be. And it becomes easily very traditional kind of, let's say, just dissemination rather than real intervention that is based on developing the agency of the participants.
You mentioned the question of the different hierarchical levels working together?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question also. We have tried various ways. In some cases, for instance, in the Oulu University Hospital with which we have worked, we have been fortunate that the top management of this given section of the hospital, this is the surgical unit, the top management wanted to participate themselves and were very actively involved in the change laboratory process. So, and it turned out that in this case, the different levels of the hierarchy were quite comfortable debating with one another. So it was not so that the top manager would make everybody else quiet. But this is not necessarily usual. So, for instance, in a big telecommunications company where we had a series of change laboratories, they did so that the frontline teams, which were the basic units of the change laboratory, they would invite in one session the manager to discuss with them about their ideas, to exchange and debate, but only in one session. So the idea was that the hierarchy is involved and that the hierarchy is informed, but the hierarchy should also give them enough space so that they can develop their own initiatives. And then the next step is, can those initiatives be accepted by the management? And of course that requires negotiation and continuous dialogue. But there is no simple solution to this.
Okay. Maybe we could discuss a little bit about agency. And that question we got from Elaine Mateus. She's from Londrina, in the south of Brazil. And she asked us about the relation between agents and the subject and the voluntarism that sometimes agency becomes. And maybe we can also relate it to some of my colleagues from the doctoral studies who are studying as well subjectiveness and agency.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah. It's a very important issue. What is the relationship between just being a subject and being an agent, or agency, subjectivity, or subjectiveness, or subjectness, as our Russian colleagues call it. Elaine, in her question, writes that some activity theory studies treat human agency as everything.
Yeah.
And tend to look at social reality as nothing but human actions.
It becomes a banalization of what agency is and what is the relevance of agency inside the activity and the activity system. Yeah,
and there are, in fact, in the broader literature in agency outside activity theory, this is very, very common, that any action that the human being takes is considered as agentive action. You know, even if you just blink your eyes, in a way you're an agent. And this, like you said, it leads to a banalization and trivialization of the concept. One important root of the concept of agency comes from Giddens and his work on structure versus agency. And the idea there is all the time that, okay, there are structures that human beings have created, various kinds of organizations, institutions, rules, etc., which kind of constrain us, and then human beings, in order to find their own way and to influence their circumstances, have to have agency, and this is the dialectic between structure and agency. And that's already more interesting because it means that not everything is agency. Agency has to be seen in relation to the structures, that you somehow manage your life by dealing actively with those structures. In our work, we actually would want to go a little bit further, and we like to talk about transformative agency. Agency as something in which human beings gain a capability to transform their collective activities. So we nowadays often add the word transformative to indicate that we don't mean just any banal sense agent, anything that human beings do, but particularly the potentials of human beings to become history makers, the transformers of their own activities. Of course, then that leaves the question, so what is the subjectivity or subjectness? Is that then everything the human being does? And I don't think so either. I think that with the concept of subjectivity, subjectness, I would like to look into the, let's say, the way a human being builds a personal relation to the activity and works out his or her conflicts and tensions in relation to the collective activity. So I see that as issues of personal sense making, you know, using Leontiev's terms, forming personal sense and relating that to the societal meaning of the activity. So issues of subjectness or subjectivity are for me issues of personal sense making and identity, you know, identifying yourself in relation to the collective activity. And issues of agency for me are primarily issues of transformation. Transformative agency understood as specific actions, not any actions, but very specific actions which have transformative potential. For instance, resisting and critiquing, or identifying possibilities, or modeling and envisioning the future, or committing to actions to change the situation, or actually then performing those actions. So we have identified at the moment, for instance, 6 types of transformative agency in actions that are taken discursively by people who participate in change laboratories, and several studies are on the way to investigate in detail the discourse in change laboratories through these sessions, how these different types of agentive, of expressions of agency are appear in the different sessions, and how they may increase or decrease, and who takes those actions, how this is distributed among the participants, to what extent do they become collective actions, to what extent do they remain just individual actions, and so on. So I think it can be, this transformative agency can be analyzed quite rigorously, okay, and should be analyzed. I don't like the idea of just broadly, you know, talking about agency in general. Mm-hmm. And the same about subjectness. I think that the work, for instance, of Annalisa Sannino on experiencing, how people deal with critical conflicts, is at the core of issues of subjectivity and subjectness. Also, I would like to see much more work on making personal sense and how to access that. We probably in the near future we will have more studies in that direction. There's a connection, of course, between personal sense making and agency, but they should not be considered one and the same thing. So I'd like to have some rather sharp analytical clarity around these concepts. At the moment, unfortunately, like you said, there is a tendency of making everything agency.
Now, do you think we can talk about Fernanda's questions?
Sure, yeah, we can try that. Do we still have time?
We still have some time.
Okay. So Fernanda's question has to do with concepts, right?
Yeah, Fernanda from Catholic University of São Paulo. It has to do with the concept formation and how the concept formation can be somehow a shared object, or is it a runaway object?
Yeah.
And do you think we should read her question to clarify?
Yeah, she says,
for the ones who are watching the interview.
Okay.
Yes.
My question would be toward the formation of concepts. Concepts are also runaway objects. When we get them as ours, they escape us and expand into new directions. Thoughtless, not imagined, even opposite. Considering the creative chain concept, which is Fernando Liberali's own concept, we thought of creating unifying traits in the concept, traits that preserve marks of previous meanings but also open to new meanings. This attempt can be seen as a contradiction in relation to the natural way of a concept formed in the wild, traveling aimlessly to unexpected places, and can this be an opportunity to collaboratively consider evolution controlled by the object? Would there be a contradiction between the concepts of free movement and deliberate predefined directions? I think this is very interesting, of course. I think that certainly, you know, it might be exaggeration to call it traveling aimlessly.
Yeah, I think 2 points that we are here discussing that are inside her question, and maybe it's something that is somehow developed for her group and for the discussion there in Brazil, but it's not for this audience more specifically.
Okay.
The concepts of runaway object and in the wild.
Yeah, need to be explained.
Yes.
Yeah. Don't worry, this can be edited. So.
Yes.
Yeah, perhaps it's best to start with those because those remain rather mysterious otherwise. By runaway object we mean the fact that, you know, the concept of object is foundational in activity theory. As Leontiev says, there is no activity without an object. And the object means it's a sort of the horizon of possibilities that the activity is oriented at, but it is not the same as a specific goal. It is broader and more difficult to define. Let's say, for instance, in healthcare activity is usually driven by the object of illness or health and illness. You know, health professionals try to fight illness. They try to heal and prevent illness. But illness is not a very specific goal or anything like that. It is a very broad object which can never be fully eradicated. It cannot be completely controlled. Therefore, it is in a way, especially some new illnesses such as various kinds of pandemias, they are actually runaway objects which are very difficult to control. They seem to pop up unexpectedly and spread globally very quickly. So those we call runaway objects, the new types of objects which have potentially this ability to escalate and spread very rapidly, out of control. They can be good as, let's say, some innovation like the Linux open source operating system became, you know, it was done by a few hackers, but suddenly it became a global innovation. On the other hand, they are often also very nasty and dangerous, such as pandemias or even more severely things like global warming or climate change or financial crisis, like we are having one in Europe at the moment. This can be called runaway objects. They start from something small and they suddenly become out of control. And so now Fernanda, I think, is asking about this runaway objects and their relation to concepts. Now here she also refers to the question of in the wild. At the moment I am having a project which is called Concept Formation in the Wild, and it refers to the fact that concept formation and conceptual change have been traditionally studied mainly in really controlled environments, classrooms and laboratories. So that you know, researchers have been interested how typically a natural science or mathematical concept is acquired by a child in a classroom. And usually those studies take very well defined concepts which already are well known and understood, and then see how children can make sense and appropriate those concepts, and what type of change it means in their previous thinking and so on. Now, we feel, and I feel, that at the moment in the world, the most interesting processes of concept formation happen outside laboratories and classrooms, when people have to face this new difficult phenomena. For instance, make sense of the financial crisis at the moment in Europe. That's a tremendous task of concept formation. How do you call it? How do you understand? How do you create a concept that would make sense and give some coherence to this phenomenon? These are processes which are very distributed. People around the world in different places are struggling with the same issues. Let's take the example of how the HIV/AIDS concept was formed. It took many years of debates and struggles between different researchers, medical practitioners, patient organizations, governments, before gradually it was stabilized so that we can now agree more or less what is the essential characteristics of HIV/AIDS. But still, a few years ago, there were even heads of state who would deny and say that no, that's not a sexually transmitted disease or something like that, which looked almost like crazy ideas. And there were always various kinds of conspiracy theories that it was this and that way started and so on. The concept formation at that level is something in which regular people in various professions are engaged, and we are interested in finding ways to understand and facilitate this kind of concept formation in the wild, so that people would not be totally at the mercy of, let's say, what they read in the newspapers or see on television, but that there would be a bit more grounded local capabilities in collectives of people to create concepts to guide their own activities. These don't have to be global concepts. They can be intermediate level concepts, like to have a concept for understanding what we are doing in our organization. Yeah. And this means that concept formation challenges, it faces a new challenge. The studies of concept formation, we are at the very beginning of this kind of research.
Okay.
And Fernanda's question is a good question, but very complicated. It's very hard to answer a question about, to which extent can these concepts become, are they, are they
free
runaway objects, or are they freely taking shape? I don't think that the concept formation ever happens completely without constraints. You see, if we look at examples of concept formation from history, there is because the object there is of pressing importance. For instance, HIV/AIDS, it was simply necessary to find an explanation and a category for this, to name it and to categorize it so that people could have some structure in the treatment, and that we could start building legislation and medical specialties and everything. So when the object is of pressing importance, it is never totally free. The object requires that people somehow find coherence. I believe that even when we see now these big debates around climate change and global warming, they will have to converge, not to total unanimity. The multi-voicedness will remain, but there must be some form of stabilization. The concept is not a concept if it's not somewhat stabilized.
would you think in some strategies to face these kinds of challenges where in a moment the object is in fact in construction and we need to face them. The question is extremely important in these aspects, but it is more, it puts us in facing the difficulty of understanding what is not already.
I agree. I agree. It seems like everything is in a flux and nothing is certain. Yes. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And there are multiple strategies that can be and need to be investigated. Of course, one of them is finding partial stabilizations, partial, let's say, elements of the concept which can be reasonably well agreed upon and used as kind of springboards for further progress. I think that if you look at the history of, for instance, cases like HIV/AIDS, you see these partial stabilizations happening, and not immediately complete consensus, but partial steps which can be agreed upon and then kind of channel the joint efforts a little bit more into same direction. The other thing is, as far as I can see, is that what we are lacking in society is genuine forums where people can actually debate and clarify their concepts. At the moment, we have a problem with the media that and the social media could become much more, I think, facilitating in this regard. Think about with people who are struggling with any such complex concepts like for instance, how to understand the financial crisis. There is very little. You cannot easily find a place in the web, for instance, where you would see the different attempts to define it and to bring them all together, to find some sort of an overview. So what we increasingly need, in my opinion, and also at the level of organizations, is various kinds of shared interfaces where the concept formation can be observed and people can get an overview of how people now are starting to understand something. At the moment, it seems to me that this kind of tools are kind of lacking, largely because the social media has allowed us to have millions of discussions which are not connected, and this large-scale sense-making efforts would require, I think, a next step in the development of social media, perhaps in the web altogether, which allow people to follow the different lines of argumentation and how they might come together or not. This is these are difficult topics. I would say that this kind of research is at the beginning, and it's a little too early to speculate too much.
Okay, so let's close.
Yeah, yes.
So we talked a little bit about the past of activity theory, going back to Leontiev, Vygotsky, Davidov, and some others regarding the foundation. We talked a little bit about the present and the projects developed at Cradle, and we just talked a little bit, but what about the future? What are the main contributions? Do you see any gap that could be fulfilled? And what are the challenges that activity theory and maybe Cradle face for the future?
Yeah. We kind of indirectly touched upon them because I think if we now kind of sum up, we talked about agency and subjectivity. Those are one area, definitely. Another area is increasingly the issue of how to study activities which have this very widespread characters that they are not only local but also increasingly global, or at least interconnected. This interconnectedness and also this potential effect of the World Wide Web and other media on activities and communities is another dimension of challenges and tasks. But perhaps the most crucial issue, I think, at the level of individual researchers and research groups is how to connect the local concrete research projects to essential societal tensions and possibilities of societal development, so that activity theoretical research must be relevant. It must aim at actually influencing people's lives, and this, I think, increasingly means that we need to somehow get engaged and get involved in important society level transformations and see their impact and how they are played out in local settings. Partly that is why I think increasingly it is important to collaborate with researchers in places like Brazil, but not only there, but in many other countries where perhaps the society is at the moment more optimistically and openly facing new challenges than in some parts of Europe and the United States. In Europe and the United States at the moment, unfortunately, the shock of becoming less and less the center of the power of the world is making societies often rather defensive, so that they feel at loss. They don't know which way to go. Okay. and this means that increasingly I think that the future of the world is shaped in not in the West but in the rest. And this means that for activity theory, they should be the activity theory, the research should be there where the future is shaped, actually, not where people are defensive and completely at loss. I'm not saying that this is so simple. Of course, we have most of our work, for instance, here in Finland, is done here in Finland, but increasingly we must make sure that we are not isolated. That's one of the challenges. Another, of course, is then also the very issue of how do we develop our methodology, interventionist methodology, when we face new cultural conditions, when we face situations in which people are, for instance, engaged also in political struggles or community-based struggles rather than only in workplaces. Our main experience comes from workplaces, but this has to be broadened. I think that in the next few years we will have an increasing number of studies, intervention studies, also using change laboratory from different countries, and we need to compare and bring those together into perhaps international publications where we look at what are the experiences and insights gained in implementing. For instance, we have a colleague in South Africa using change laboratory to work with some local villages on the prevention of HIV/AIDS, and how to work with the villagers among whom this disease is widespread, and to help them build new ways of preventing it. That's a very different challenge from working in a Finnish hospital or a Finnish school. So this comparisons and lessons gained across these cultural boundaries will be very, very central.
Okay. Would you like to say anything else?
No, I think that's it.
That's it? Okay.
We would like to thank you for the
Thank you.
opportunity. And okay, so that we hope that we will have an opportunity to prepare this and present it in Brazil, and also maybe having you visiting us in another moment.
Yeah, we will. I just have to take care of my health so that when I take these trips, that I'm well prepared and in good shape. So I definitely think that it would be in the agenda for the near future, and we'll make sure. If you have a situation with this that you need something like clarification or something, I'm available.
Okay.
And you can even, if something is said badly, I can even reformulate it if needed.
Okay, but okay. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'm sorry it will be quite messy to edit that.
No, we had time.
Okay.
Of course.
Yeah, it's okay.
So good.
Okay, so
Alright.
would you like to close in front of the camera? Yes?
Huh?
Would you like to make a close in...
Oh.
No?
I hope
No.
I hope the equipment worked. It
Yeah.
would be terrible to realize that something went wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's okay. Thank you so much. I think it's going to be very important. Oops.
And
For
I'm
everyone.
sorry that we couldn't answer Fernanda's question.
but-
It would require an entirely